Liberal states should not be economically interconnected and interdependent with illiberal states. And we see that when we reduce this interdependence, we see benefits both for the liberal states and for the lives of those people living in the illiberal states. So firstly, we see liberal states as being places like Australia, New Zealand, Europe. You know, these are places usually like with democracies, with good like minimum wages, with like good like economic laws, all of that, all of those good things. Whereas we see illiberal states being places like Russia and China in the Middle East, where we see things like human rights abuses taking place. We see things like a really, poor minimum wage. So workers there are like working 3 jobs just to try and get by. We see like a lot more inequality between like different races in these places, between like the rich and the poor. And today I'll be proving in my speech why we're going to strengthen liberal states when we reduce this economic interdependence, and how this will make lives better for people in illiberal states. So firstly, just to define how we see this shift happening, is that it would obviously be gradual. It will be something that you work towards over time, rather than just being able to happen overnight. And it's just a gradual reduction in this interdependence. So what we firstly see from this is that liberal states now have sort of like a greater bargaining power with these illiberal states. So when states are interdependent, there's kind of a mutual reliance, whether that's from like the money they're gaining from trade, whether that's from like specific goods they need, like specialist goods that come from certain countries. So now when these liberal states reduce the trade that they make with these illiberal states miss out on that money. They miss out on those products, and that kind of hurts them, right? Because at the point where they can no longer trade with a lot of places, or trade a lot less, like they're missing out on a lot of revenue for their country. They're also missing out on a lot of goods. So people in these countries are likely to be really unhappy. And if the government wants to like stay in power and stay in control, they're likely to like adjust their beliefs, like their illiberal beliefs, in order to like be able to get some of this trade back. And we see this being a really positive thing for workers in these countries, because while in the short term there may be some negative effects, as in like they're losing some of this money and some of this trade, but in the long term we see like it's really, really positive, because your government is now being forced to shift away from the really negative things that they've been doing. Like for instance, we see China committing like massive human rights abuses, and nobody is really able to like stop them or do anything about that, because there's so much interdependence with China, and this is happening in countries in the Middle East and things like that. So when we start to reduce this trade, we have a lot more influence over them, and we're like pushing them to have to change a lot more than we were before. Because we see on the other side of the house, when they still have this interdependence, right, there's really like they don't have any power to push them to change. Like, yeah, they can go and like talk to them maybe and say like, oh, hey guys, we don't really think you should be doing this, but that has no influence, that has no like power over them. And also they probably don't even want to do this, because they don't want to hurt those trade relations, because if you're kind of relying on them for certain goods, you don't want to upset that relationship. So when we start shifting away from that relationship, we get a lot more power than the other side is able to get. And we also see that doing it by shifting away the economy, that's like a relatively safe, passive way for liberal states to make this known. Like there's likely to be not too much backlash from another state, because it's like a relatively passive way to make your push, rather than having to be outwardly aggressive. I'll take a POI before I move on to my next point, if you guys have one.
How can we protect minorities in illiberal states when we have no trading power on your side of the house?
So we are pushing them to want to change by reducing our trade with them. Like that is where our power is coming from. So to move on to my next point, We see better economies in liberal states, and we see benefits in liberal states. Because as they shift away from trading with these illiberal states and trading with each other and within themselves, we see like a massive growth in the economy in these liberal states because they're no longer like outsourcing all of the stuff from illiberal states. Like a lot more trade and a lot more production and development is happening within liberal states. So we see that this is a really positive thing because usually, you know, in liberal states, like we said, people are getting paid more. People are getting like better jobs. And we see that on the other side of the house, all of these benefits, like all of this money from that trade is like going towards propping up these illiberal states and their government. Whereas on our side of the house, we're taking that like those benefits of that trade away from them and it's going into strengthening liberal states and liberal economies rather than continuing to prop up the illiberal states and illiberal economies, which as we know is really harmful. And my second speaker will also introduce a split around how there's also a lot of benefits to the environment when we shift away from these illiberal states because we see illiberal states usually don't have the same protections for the environment in place that liberal states would. And so we really see that by pushing away from this economic interdependence, we are able to really like create a long-term political shift to liberalism because we're pushing the governments in these illiberal states to now want to, like they're obviously going to want to trade with these liberal states because liberal states, you know, like they make up a lot of the world, they produce a lot of goods. So they're going to want to like trade with them and they're going to realize in order to trade for them, they need to change some of what they're doing. So in conclusion, we're able to have better lives for those in illiberal states as the government changes and strengthen liberal states and their governments. Thank you.
In order for the affirmative team to be able to get their case off the ground, they have to be able to guarantee to us that illiberal states are going to act in a better, more positive manner when their literal trade with other more powerful economic partners is reduced. What I'm going to show you in the speech is firstly why the hardship for citizens within these liberal countries is actually increased when this trade is reduced. And then secondly, why the difficulty for liberal states to be improved. One thing I want to make clear right from the beginning is everything for the second point is exclusive because we still maintain the ties with these illiberal countries. We actually have the means of changing them on our side of the house. All of my rebuttal is going to be integrated throughout the speech. First, though, I'd like to start with some characterization. We tell you what liberal states look like. It's a lot similar to what the affirmative team has told us. We tell you the rights and freedoms of citizens are oppressed. We tell you that these tend to be developing countries where rights literally are not prioritized. or like in the rare cases where like the liberal countries are prospering economically, there is clearly purposeful attempts to like oppress the liberality of their citizens, usually in the interest of maintaining power. Like the affirmative team, we tell you that like the reduction in economic interdependence and interconnection is aimed at like applying economic pressure to these illiberal countries. All right, now I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 5 mechanisms as to why these illiberal countries are going to increase the hardship for their citizens when this like trade interconnection and interdependence is reduced. Note that this all responds to these like the incentives which have been told about and like in terms of how illiberal states are going to act on the affirmative side of the house. So here's our take on things. Firstly, we tell you that economic difficulty is going to result on less emphasis on rights, right? So what's going to happen is more economic pressure, will worsen the economic conditions within countries. We tell you that illiberal countries tend to be developing. We tell you, like, for example, if people like struggling to pay for food to eat, they're not going to be inclined to be like considering their rights, to be thinking about the rights. Same goes for like policymakers, for those who actually have the power to like bring rights to the individuals and like liberality to the individuals. That isn't going to be on the forefront of their mind when their citizens like struggling to like meet, like to be able to eat. Secondly, is that groups are going to be scapegoated. We tell you that the ruling power in these countries are going to look to like blame groups of their population for their suffering. Again, this is the case for both the developing countries and for like those like even those ones that like flourish economically, where they like want to oppress their citizens. We tell you like an example of this is like the dawn raids being blamed on the perception that Pacifica people are like were weighing down the healthcare system. And like in simple terms, this example shows that when things get bad, people choose groups to blame. That what we tell you is this makes things worse in terms of citizen hardship within these like developing and like illiberal countries. Thirdly, is we tell you that there is going to be less like financial flourishment for the individual in in these illiberal countries. This is like a really exclusive point because we tell you that less trade is going to result in like less potential for individuals to be able to develop themselves economically. This looks like an individual like trying to set up a business or like employees of that business being affected by like an inability to create to get like their supplies and create supply chains overseas with these other like larger liberal countries, which we've been told have got increased production power by if they're unable to do that, they've got less means of being able to better themselves economically, and they don't have like the means, they don't have the political capital to advocate for their own rights, like even if they wanted to. Again, if you're poor and struggling, you're not like you won't be as like inclined to go out there and like call out how badly you're being mistreated within your respective country. Also, we tell you that there's going to be more reliance placed on the state. We tell you that this is like this directly contends with their points about like how the state is going to change itself. We tell you that in fact there'll be more reliance placed on the state because citizens are going to be like worse off economically, especially for like in these liberal countries where they're often like oppressed. Therefore, they're going to have to rely on their state for handouts, right? They've got bad economic conditions. Again, trying to live like paycheck to paycheck. They're gonna have to rely like on their states to provide for them. We tell you then that they're going to have to become more accepting of their state's like a liberal ideology. That's literally the hand that's feeding you. You're not going to bite it. You're not thinking about whether your country is acting like in the interest of liberalism when it's feeding you. All of that means that there is more reliance placed on the state. Therefore, the state is even less inclined to change, like we've been told like they will by the affirmative team. That does not happen in their world. Fifthly, is we tell you that citizens are actually going to become resentful when their economic like prosperity is reduced. Like we have to like this is all in comparative to like whether it's like they're going to get like this collective changes and like how things are seen. We tell you this is a lot more probable on our side because citizens are going to see like these liberal states who have all the production power pulling out and like economically harming them because their economic conditions are now worse. They're going to dislike these liberal states, literally making the quality of their life worse. They will like, and that blinds them to see to see what liberalism actually is and what's actually good about it. You're not going to care. You're going to see like liberalism as the enemy when it's causing like all your economic hardship. The impacts of this as individuals in these illiberal countries have got less means of bettering themselves. There's increased like power being placed in the hands of like a liberal ruling powers who have shown themselves to be illiberal already, and also like citizens don't recognize or even like accept liberalism, and like on both sides of the house, that's what we want to be advocating for to be brought into these liberal countries. It does not make its way in on the affirmative side of the house. Between points, I will take a POI if you have one. Okay, guess I'll just carry on. Secondly, on the difficulty then for liberal states to be improved. So 5 mechanisms, note that these are all exclusive on our side of the house. Firstly, we tell you that reduced partnership results in less contact with liberal states, like between like them and these liberal states. So illiberal countries see like the actual example of liberalism less and less. Again, both sides want liberalism to like emerge in these liberal countries. If you don't even like make contact and see the example, which is supposedly like going to be aspiring toward, then you're never going to get there. You don't know how to get there. You literally don't know like how to be a liberal country, because now you don't have any connections with them. You don't even like, you don't literally see the example which they supposedly set for you. Also, secondly, this is in contention with the point about bargaining power. We tell you that literally there's going to be reduced like bargaining power. We tell you this is simply like straightforward, and that reducing trade results in like reduced leverage. Again, since like liberal countries are apparently the ones with more production power. Again, I remind you, AFA's told us that they've got less leverage to call out like illiberal states and like call out the bad practice. On our side, since they're still there, they've actually got like the means of making threats. They've got like, you know, there's more dependence between the two countries. That increases bargaining power if they've still got like that reliance on, like if illiberal states still have that reliance on them. Also, we tell you that illiberal countries like strengthen ties with each other. Like this looks like entering into relations like with even more oppressive states now that like liberal countries aren't like doing the job for them. This creates a collective like hatred toward liberalism, building up those barriers to stop it entering their country. Fourthly, we tell you that like the liberal states, much like liberal states, much like their citizens, are going to become resentful towards liberal states. They're literally being like rejected. Like liberal states are saying like, no, I don't want you. You're not good enough. Like on the international stage, they're probably going to like despise liberal states and see like their ideology as the enemy. Also, we tell you that illiberal states are going to be better able to cover up their oppression, because there's no like liberal like representatives, individuals on the ground in their country. Impacts of this is that liberalism is literally seen as the enemy, no means of like bettering themselves, like the citizens and for the country. That's why we're so proud to negate on our side of the house.
The negating team has come up and told us today that their method for pushing liberal states towards liberalism is to do exactly what we've said, is to threaten to do exactly what we've said we'll do. They've said their way to move states towards liberalism is to threaten to reduce economic interdependence, as opposed to what we on the affirming side propose to do, which is actually do it, to actually force them to move away, to actually move away and actually force liberal states to move towards liberalism. Why does this happen? So what we see is that in illiberal states, the rights of people suck. Like people are oppressed. They're on they're paid not enough to live on, and so by liberal states stopping like profiting off this, what we see is that now like illiberal states have less money. They're put into a bad position, and this forces citizens of these states into a position where they're encouraged to like. I'm happy to take PY.
Should we be giving liberal states more means of spreading propaganda against liberal ideologies such as freedom and rights?
Because I don't understand how you think propaganda against giving someone their rights work. I don't understand how the negating team proposes an illiberal state says, you don't actually want to be treated like a human being. You don't actually want to be paid enough to live on. How does an illiberal state convince someone of, that this is true? I do not think, or we on the affirming team do not believe it is realistic that a person is going to be convinced that they don't even want a living wage, that they do not want to live humanely. And so, for this reason, we think, people live, citizens of liberal states do want to move towards liberalism where they've got equal rights. And as that situation gets worse, they're kind of pushed into a position where they're more likely to take action. And also, we think, looking at the people who are actually running these countries, they're more likely to take action because when their countries, a lot less rich, they've got a lot less money, it starts affecting their bottom line. It starts affecting their quality of life because if no one's buying their goods, it doesn't matter how cheap the labor is, they still can't, they're not able to sell it, they're not able to make money. And so what this means is that we're seeing shifts away from a liberalism, in ways that the negating team only threatens to do. They do not actually see these changes. Moving on to our split point about the environment and how we think this affects the environment. We think that, in general, liberal states are much more likely to be environmentally friendly and have environmental protections than illiberal states. This is primarily for two reasons. One is, just as a rule, by definition, liberal states stand for equality and freedom for all. And when we have, massive, corporations polluting the environment and destroying the environment, this, takes away from people's ability to live a healthy life and their freedom to live a healthy life and their, equality with people who live in healthy areas. So we think liberal states are more likely to have, or are by definition going to have environmental protection laws in place that prevent destruction of the environment. And also when you're living in, when products are produced in liberal states, these companies have to pay a living wage to their workers. And so what does this mean? This means the product costs more, which means the consumer expects it to last longer, and they expect a higher quality of the product. And so what this means is that the products that are being produced in liberal states also last longer, and as such, they produce less waste and less waste in the environment and in landfill and places like that. And so for these two primary reasons, we see less environmental pollution when production is shifted to liberal states. What does this actually do? What does it achieve? It means we see primarily poor people or people living in island nations, less affected by things like climate change and horrible pollution. This is people who live in coastal cities, not having increased tornado risk and not being forced to move out of their home where they've lived because it's being flooded every other weekend as sea level rises, and we see increased extreme weather. And so by shifting to production into liberal states, we see this massive environmental benefit for all these people. Continuing on the thought process behind or actually does the negating team want to give a POI?
How do you improve the environment when millions of citizens are starving as a result of economic losses?
So the issue here is, first of all, realistically, even if we accepted that we did see an economic collapse, which we don't, but realistically, that is not contingent upon the environment improving. But we see the environment improving, but also we don't see these economic collapse because, if we were to see economic collapse in a place like China, in a place like Russia, or, a place like Singapore or Hong Kong, we'd see massive protesting. And what this means is the government is unable to keep up a system like this where the people are actively fighting back. The way a liberal state thrives is by keeping people just well off enough that they don't think their situation is bad enough to actually do something about it, that they don't think their situation is bad enough to go out and protest, that they don't think their situation is bad enough, to risk, backlash from the government. And so when we actually show them how horrible their government is being to them and force them to realize this, they become, it provides the impetus to actually see change in these liberal countries and to actually, force these leaders to change. And again, also we see the incentive from the leaders who, as of currently, live off the profits from these countries And when that country stops making as many profits, they're incentivized to fix that. How do they fix that? It's through, engaging with liberalism so that able to like trade with these economic superpowers and with these other people. And so this is why, fundamentally, when we reduce economic interdependence with illiberal states, we see an increase in liberality in general. But also about economic interdependence, the negating team supposes that they're going to threaten things like sanctions upon these illiberal states, but they're ignoring that the fact in the motion, which is interdependence. These liberal states are also dependent upon these illiberal states. We cannot just stop like sanctions aren't as much of a threat. Like we need to a shift is needed slowly from interdependence to dependence, because when a liberal state sanctions an illiberal state, they see massive damages to their economy as well. And so this is why, we don't really think that threat, is even likely to happen. And
Thank you. Sorry about that. Three, two, one. When the US, a liberal state which should value the lives of minorities, led to 100,000 Afghani children starving as a direct result of hardship and starvation caused by economic sanctions, they allowed illiberalism to flourish and even partook in that same exact illiberalism. We cannot justify punishing a population of citizens for the actions of an out-of-control government that they have no ability to change. What I'm going to start off with is proving why regional relationships will immensely suffer. So first off, I'd like to say that regional ties between liberal and illiberal countries exist, particularly in places such as in Africa. Oh, do you think the internet's cutting out?
It might be the internet actually.
That was muted.
Was the yes, for some reason it just said we're muted. That's so strange. Okay.
All right. Can you tell me when I get to 59 seconds and I'll just start my timer again? Wait, what? I'm at 59 seconds because I keep speaking. Where did you guys get cut off? Like, had I gone into my point yet?
You were at. I would be happy if you want us to start again.
Yeah. Could I start again? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry about that. Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1. When the US, a liberal state which should value the lives of minorities, led to 100,000 Afghani children starving to death as a direct result of hardship caused by economic sanctions, they allowed illiberalism to flourish and even partook in that exact same liberalism. We cannot justify punishing millions of citizens for the actions of an out-of-control government, which they have no say in the way in which it operates. So I'm going to get into my first point, and then I'll move on to some rebuttal. So my point is over why regional relationships immensely suffer. So we would say that regional ties between liberal and illiberal countries exist are sort of the foundation of how democratic countries grow, because they must rely on geographical ties before they move into the global market. They have a lot of, we would see this within, for example, the African Union, which has a mix of both liberal and illiberal countries. Under the MOOT, they have to cut down on the economic ties between these, which means stuff like free trade is no longer possible. Geographic ties become less important than political ties, and places where the regional ties attempt to grow are held back. This is not this being gradual means there's no clear cutoff, meaning that the countries which are illiberal are able to sabotage and perceive everyone else as untrustworthy during the process. This would occur in places such as the European Union, which is filled with countries like Poland, which are illiberal and would actively harm the rest of the European Union while they're still present. This is why you cannot have a gradual cutoff, and when you attempt to have that, you do not succeed. So first, 5 ways in which they achieve this. So number 1, illiberal actions are seen as not their problem, particularly the case because they have too many things to focus on in their own country, with the dealing with pulling out from China and the loss of infrastructure deals, which come with that. Number 2, tensions will grow. Free trade in the EU and the African Union halts. World and regional connectivity is vital for developing countries because they cannot survive by themselves. If we do not allow developing countries to uplift one another in the way in which they currently do, they will not survive and they will never flourish. Additionally, they will never become liberal to the same degree because you cannot provide rights when you do not have enough money to feed every single citizen. Number 3, illiberal states turn to massive superpowers, for example, China. These are largely left unchecked and perform better than the liberal states would that were left behind by the rest of the West. We would say that illiberal states working together actually radicalizes all of the countries that are involved because they are going to just continue to spread their propaganda and continue to fester their hatred for the Western countries, or for the liberal countries, sorry. So they also take advantage of countries, China and global superpowers like that also take advantage of countries like Kenya strategically. This means they grow in power and use like the Horn of Africa as a strategic location in which they can spread illiberalism and radicalize the government. So number 4, we would also say liberal states in these countries are largely ignored by the West under the status quo. The West is going to be overwhelmed by forming these new large connections and also struggling economically because they have cut down the trading ties, meaning they can no longer support and uplift the liberal states within these demographics too. This means that they not only cannot rely on regional relations when the developing countries that surround them are liberal, they can't turn to the superpowers like China and like America, and the loans are largely unavailable if a country is struggling. They don't ever fix the problems, and the IMF is a last chance for a reason. Even if liberal countries do provide support, the power imbalance that doesn't come with regional relationships ultimately leads to these countries potentially being manipulated. For example, the Western conglomerate ExxonMobil significantly underpaying Guyana when they made their contract to extract oil from their forests and land. At a time when countries need to work together to prosper, the outcomes of cutting down on these global and geographical ties are clear. Developing countries do not have a GDP high enough to deal with poverty. People literally starve to death. They don't have homes and they don't ever grow, and you allow illiberalism to flourish. We would also say economic reliance on China and the few limited superpowers leads to more environmental harms because they do not have enough money or land to survive without taking advantage of their forests, of their natural resources, of increasing mining, because they don't have the infrastructure needed to survive on their own. They cannot exist at the same level that they could otherwise. So I'm going to move on to some rebuttal soon, but I will take a POI if you have one. No?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
At the point where you stand for illiberal countries being poor, but also at the point where they have enough influence, like China, to infiltrate these other illiberal countries, like where do you stand on this part?
So illiberal countries are obviously varied. It's a spectrum. There are illiberal countries that are immensely powerful, like China, which have grown and festered their influence in other countries, and they are illiberal because they have the choice to be illiberal. We would say countries which are currently developing do not have the choice, right? They don't have a government. They have largely a corrupt government quite often. That's why they're underdeveloped. So we do have quite a big difference between China and these poor countries. Additionally, when we say poor, what we mean is the citizens, right? Because a lot of these developing countries, and even China themselves, have a massive amount of citizen poverty. So that's why that still stands. So how would this shift happen? What we heard from Affirmative was that there would be a gradual reduction and that they can adjust. Well, we would say so can the illiberal countries. Sorry, they can just switch their trade ties if you truly stand for that. It is literally impossible also to actually enforce this because it cannot be incremental when a large amount of these ties are founded in massive factories, which when shut down lead to thousands being fired, and it must happen at some point to actually see any change. So even incrementally on the ground, you cannot achieve this gradually. We would also say that this is not possible, given that illiberal countries provide literal necessities. They have certain manufacturing infrastructure, resources, and mining that simply cannot be replaced for these liberal countries. Additionally, we would just say that illiberal states would just pull out independently regardless, right? They want these Western states to suffer because they're putting them through harm. So I'm going to look at why people being unhappy doesn't necessarily mean that the government changes anything at all. 4 reasons for this. So number 1, the government largely suppresses the population with military action and threats to jail them if they speak out. For example, in China. Number 2, they don't vote the government in because they're largely undemocratic. So they don't have any say in who is in the government. We'd also say a starving population is not a powerful population. They don't think rationally. They cannot group together. They literally do not have the fighting power, and they don't have the means to think ahead because they are starving to death. They do not have time to worry about what the government is doing when they are starving in their own backyards. Number 4, quite often they blame other minorities in the West using propaganda to push that influence onto others and to blame other people so that the government never actually sees any consequences. People are unhappy under the status quo and they're fully aware of how bad their lives are, but they cannot change because the government refuses to change. We would also say even if they do have some action and break through these barriers, the government can't be overthrown without revolutions and civil wars, which you cannot stand for. We would also say that illiberal states missing out on money and products, well, people missing out on these goods literally take thousands of lives. You cannot underplay the short-term effects on citizens. It additionally just doesn't change much for the governments. It's a largely ineffective way of dealing with any problems with the government because it fully places the blame on the citizens to do something to change them. We would also say they just turn to other liberal countries, particularly if you give them the time to do so. So will they change to trade in them? No, they don't know how to change. The citizens aren't having any pressures. They have long-term, there's no long-term turn, there's a long-term turn to other liberal states, despite backlash from liberal countries on their human rights abuse, so they don't go into trade with them again. This is why we are proud to negate. Yeah.
What are our burdens in today's debate as the affirmative side? So we have to prove that we will see an overall improvement in the amount of countries that turn liberal, as we both agreed that this improves the livelihood of the working class and the people in general. 2 points of clash today. Firstly, how do we make a state liberal? Secondly, what is the effect on citizens on either side of the house? So firstly, I would just like to add at the point where the negating side wants to characterize our model as a gradual decrease in this
in this relationship to a complete stop in this relationship. We think that we did not characterize this. We want a gradual increase to the extent that countries are then motivated to turn liberal. We're not completely shutting off all trades. You can literally read that in the moot. So we just don't want to stand on the points where we completely decrease all relationships. So moving on to that first point of clash, how do we make a state more liberal? So they came out and said, they didn't actually provide any ways in which a state will be more liberal. And Adjudicator, we both agreed that, liberal is better because liberal provides more, basic human rights, than in a liberal government. This is very clear in today's debate. So there are two, what we have proposed in our model at First Speaker is that we will actively incentivize these states to become liberal. Two main ways we did this. With the liberal bargaining power, at the point where you're a liberal state and you go, hey, look, we're not going to want to trade with you until, you release the Uyghur Muslims. Things like that could even be a smaller, point in which a country moves to being more liberal. So how did we say this? We said this when we talked about reducing this interdependence. This means that states become because at a point where it's China, because at the point where China is illiberal, they're going to be inclined to want to keep these trades. They have as much power to stand on their own, but they're very structured around funding other countries, things like that. So we think this is huge. And just on that, the bargaining power, even in looking at this in smaller countries, so places in Africa that are illiberal, this just looks we think we're not going to trade with you until you provide more general human rights to your public, things that aren't going to actually completely cripple this government. I think at the point that this would happen, it would be when these ties are completely removed. So how does the negating side not actually prove this? We think that this is a benefit purely on our side of the house, because we can actively, at the point where we get one country to turn liberal, at the point where we even get multiple countries to just take a step towards liberalism, we get better human rights overall. They wanted to talk about this would just completely cripple, citizens and their government. And we just don't think this is clear. And I will talk about that in my second point of clash, but I will take a POI.
How do they provide more human rights when the GDP is too low to keep people fed and housed?
We think that this, in places like China, okay, I'll talk about this in terms of the two different illiberal countries, states that both sides have recognized. When looking at China as a bigger illiberal state, they can just do this. We think that they can do this through states and maybe putting in more regulations into their legislation. This is something we think China can do easily because they are a huge economic power. When looking at these illiberal states that maybe have less economic power, these could be things, I did talk about this when looking at that clash, but this could be things just improving the minimum wage 20 cents or to a point where it pushes to be more liberal. We don't think that this would completely cripple the power of the illiberal state, because at the point where they become more liberal, then liberal countries under this model that we are proposing are more likely to trade with them. Therefore, that increases the power, the things overall. So moving on to the second point of what is the impact on citizens, I just wanted to go on to the thing they talked about, citizens are less inclined to buy into this liberalism because of this, countries are going to put out propaganda because they're going to feel threatened by these liberal countries imposing on them. We think at the point where our second speaker very clearly structured this and showed why this wouldn't be true. But I think firstly, at the point where illiberal governments are saying we hate America because they're the reasons you're not getting basic human rights, I think it would be very hard to structure that around America and liberal governments, because at the point where they're being paid 2 cents an hour and at the point where people in America are being paid a much higher living wage, I think it is very clear you cannot completely change your citizens into thinking they don't deserve a living wage just because of liberalism. And they talked about
financial flourishment of people in these liberal states is going to be less likely. So they tried to characterize, the average citizen, like we both established, like in some of these illiberal states, these people are very poor. Again, in all illiberal states, they don't have great rights, things like that. But under their side of the house, they have to prove that this means that these people can still build businesses, which, okay, at the point that this is true, and I'll explain why this is not true, like we still win on the margin that countries are going to engage with liberalism. We think that this is the point we are going to win on when we can prove that countries are more likely to engage with liberalism, therefore in the long term increasing, the overall rights of their countries. So when we see this, moving on to the point of why this is not true in the financial flourishment, we think that this is just not true, because when you are a citizen in a country and you're already working 3 jobs a day, you're just not going to be likely to be like, okay, like I have slightly more resources to build a business. We just don't think this is a benefit they can claim on their side of the house. We think that citizens aren't going to be able to flourish, especially under status quo. And at the point where we can give them more rights in the future, we think that's at the point where citizens can flourish. So we think that even at the point where we get some short-term issues of financial discouragement from these illiberal places, we think in the long term, when we build onto when these countries are more inclined to go liberal, gradually, we see just better human rights overall, and this looks like better wages. And at that point where countries are more liberal, then liberal countries are more likely to trade with them. It is a flow-on effect, and therefore these issues and this model does not impose on them anymore, because now they are more liberal. So just looking at what our world would look like. Yes, I just characterized in the short term, it could be slightly worse, but we're not going to see a complete cripple of all illiberal governments. We think that even at the point where developing nations become slightly more impoverished, the people become slightly more impoverished, this isn't going to completely fall, because there is not this fine line. We think that countries can still rebuild, and especially under a liberal state, they're more likely to be supported by liberal governments to rebuild, things like that. So we think when we proved our burden that we improved citizens' lives overall, we won this debate. Thank you very much.
Can you guys hear me? Sweet. Opposition's pathway to victory in today's debate is to prove that they will get more bargaining power on their side of the house, which inherently will mean they can force and encourage other states to become liberal who in the first place were illiberal. Their whole case is contingent on the fact they get more bargaining power. If I prove that we get equal or even a teeny bit more bargaining power, we win today's debate, because that is what their case stands on. Cool. 3 main things in today's debate. Firstly, on who gets more bargaining power, surprisingly. Secondly, on a principle behind liberal states and what they should stand for. And thirdly, on the model, thinking about how that works, what we've heard from opposition. Cool. Now for the first point of clash on who gets more bargaining power. Because as I said in my introduction, we win if we prove that we have more bargaining power. So what have you heard from opposition in today's debate? We firstly heard that they have more bargaining power because they reduce trade. Illiberal states miss out on money, they feel really bad, they want to change. 2 main responses here. Firstly, is the only way for opposition to actually get bargaining power power is by threatening to trade less. Because in the first place, they've already decreased trade by 50%, which means they already have less dependency on that liberal state, right? The liberal state and the illiberal state have less dependency. What that means is the illiberal state will like lose trust with this liberal state. They will start to replace it. They'll think, they're not going to help me. I have no way of getting this money back, because in the motion it just says reduces. They have no way to get it back, which means they're forced to find alternatives. This means they move to things like other authoritarian states who give them money. This means even less dependency on liberal states, because they now have less connection, less means of keeping with them. That means they're more likely to move up to other illiberal states, creating less connection with liberal states. These liberal states are really bad because they don't care about human rights. They want to oppress people even more. They have no like incentive to keep things like really good, whereas the liberal states have incentives to actually look after human rights, because they're a liberal state, they care about them. Human rights are really good because people feel happy. It's good to make people feel happy. That's what liberal states stand for. When you have liberal states working with the liberal state, this means a whole bunch of people who don't give a crap about human rights. That's really harmful, because we care about these people. We want to prosper them. We don't want to put them in a ditch like opposition wants to do. My second response here is just that on our side of the house, we have greater bargaining power because there's more dependency. I think this is pretty clear. But when you trade this on 50% and you say, I'm going to decrease it, they're like, sorry, they're like, well, hold on a second. I rely on you so much more than opposition. So because they rely on them more, they're more likely to try and keep that. We have more means of saying, we're going to take this all away from you. Opposition's already half taken it away. We're going to say, we're going to take it all away from you. That's going to make them change. Because more trade equals more dependency, and because the liberal state is doing better. When their state's doing better, they can call things cool. Well, that also, so at the end of this little subsection, we've proved that we get more bargaining power. Opposition has less bargaining power. Because we have more bargaining power, we win today's debates. Cool. We've also had this claim from opposition that liberal states won't call out illiberal states because of trading relationship. Two responses here. First is just that this is identical under both sides. If there's such good ties, you've really cut them. Liberal states are already doing worse. My second response here is that it's like in a liberal state's incentives to uphold rights. They want to uphold rights. They want to keep human rights. Incentive because they're liberal, they care about minorities and rights, and they've got an obligation to look after them. They're in a privileged position. They want to help everyone. They want to look after like Uyghur Muslims in China, for example. This looks like the USA calling out China for oppression against Uyghur Muslims. This has happened. China didn't cut off relations with USA. What happened was China was like, okay, we'll stop this a teeny bit and we'll still keep trading because we're such good partners. If USA said, I'm going to stop funding you by $7 billion, now can you stop that? They're going to be like, well, hold on a second. You've already left me in the dish. You've already left me. I'm going to try and replace you with Russia. Russia's got even worse intentions, harm minorities even more. So at the end of this point, we've shown you that we get more bargaining power by a fraction. That means we've already won today's debate because we can already force these countries more because they have more dependency on us. Cool. Now I'm going to move on to this principle behind liberal states, because I think this is where we push the margin in today's debate, because we've already proved we've won. We've won by 1 point. Yay, cool. So now this is how we win by a teeny bit more, by proving that the principle behind liberal states. Because what we've heard from opposition is this absurd claim at second that more development in liberal states is good. Liberal states have more resources. We should like really connect with them. Two responses here. First is just the only way to actually increase these illiberal states is through relationship. If you leave them by themselves, they have no people keeping them accountable, because West has an incentive to like help environmental stuff. These illiberal states have no incentives when West is not holding them accountable, when West isn't helping them along, holding their hand. This means they're going to go to even worse actors who don't care about the environment even more. Even if like we get minimal change under our side of the house, there's still an incentive like to try and get them into trade agreements, to try and get them in COP27. Opposition just has Russia and China working together. Two people who don't care about the environment in today's debate. That's really harmful. My second response is that we just don't really care about lifting these like liberal states up, because it's cool. Yes, they may like lift liberal states up, which we've proven you they don't. But what we care about is spreading liberal ideologies, is like uplifting minorities. We do this by like having dependency, having more bargaining power. We get that on our side of the house, because these are people who are being harmed. We care about these minorities. We want to actually uplift them. Opposition has failed to acknowledge this. The biggest actor in today's debate, they've just claimed we want to uplift liberal states, but the only way to uplift liberal states is by spreading democratic ideologies, which is working with economic relationships, because you share knowledge, you share understanding. When you have relationships, you have like subconsciously share ideologies, which means you benefit minorities in this country. You give them an idea of what it's like to be in a democratic country. Opposition has to stand for these minorities feeling betrayed by democracies, being betrayed by liberalism, because that's the reason they're in poverty. That's the reason why their country's doing even worse. So at the end of this little subpoint, we've proven that liberal states don't really matter. When we have liberal states and liberal states working, they can share ideologies. We help the minorities, because when you're just working and you're just in a liberal state, and liberal states don't care about the population. Liberal states have like amnesty and stuff. They have like incentives to help these people. They have incentives to actually look after minorities' obligations. When you're just working within a liberal state, no one's holding them accountable. We have accountability on our side of the house. We've also heard this last push that liberal states stand for freedom. It's hard to live lives with no pollution. This whole environmental push as second. My first response here is that just opposition wants to solve this by leaving them alone. If China's doing really bad and you just leave, China's going to be like, well, hold on a second. Oh no, what a shame. I'm going to replace you with Russia. Russia doesn't give a crap about the environment. That means two states, bad actors, don't care about environment. I don't think it takes a mathematician to realize that that means even worse environmental problems. What this means is that on our side of the house, when you have a liberal state and a liberal state working together, they help each other. There's an incentive. There's no incentive on the opposition side. The only way to actually uplift the state is giving them economic money, giving them money to make green technology, giving them money to make like a whole bunch of that stuff. We get that on our side of the house because we're not having two bad actors working together. I'll quickly take a POI before I move on.
At the point where we increase trading between liberal countries, how does that not increase the economic impact between these liberal countries?
You're literally just lifting up liberal countries. By lifting up liberal countries, you don't lift up illiberal countries. You further push them out. You further make them sit in a table with no liberal countries around them. You further make them like this boys' club. No one goes in there, just a whole bunch of illiberal people. That's really harmful because they just share ideologies. They've got no competition. Cool. Now for this last point about the model, because they've talked about how illiberal states will change their behavior to get money back. The thing is, if they don't prove this, we win by a huge margin because they get no change. First, my response here is just I'm unsure where the benchmark is because they've said if they get better, they can get a whole bunch of that trade back. I'm unsure how that happens because we didn't hear that in the model. So what that makes me lead to is that Nick gave you 4 minutes explaining that when you cut ties, they're going to act badly. I'm just going to reiterate that. Firstly, there's just reduced partnership, less contact with illiberal states and liberal states, more dependency on state, less rights happening in that state. Secondly, just illiberal ties increased. These people go to a lot of the liberal states who don't care about minorities. Thirdly, it just resentment towards liberal states. This is strengthened by propaganda. The China will just spread propaganda against liberal states happening under status quo. It's even further happening under opposition side because these people are feeling direct harms from this. So at the end of this, what we've proven is that liberal states will stay illiberal when left behind by West. This means more propaganda created, rights decrease. That's really hard, but we care about rights. Turn of illiberalism. So proud to negate this motion and actually stand for liberalism. Unmuted.
The affirmative teams continued maintaining that their policy of passive economic withdrawal will leave illiberal states in such a harmful position that they will change their ways and embrace liberalism. Even though we've shown you down the line that you will never adopt the way of thinking of somebody who is literally inflicting harm on you. Also, we've proved that you are reducing the leverage that you have to threaten any measures in the future when you're literally decreasing these ties like AF wants to. First point of clash then on the response prompted in illiberal countries by this course of action, by far the biggest point of clash in this debate. We've been told by the affirmative team that illiberal states will change their beliefs in order to get their trade back, and also as a result of the severe economic pressure caused by this decrease in trade. We tell you that F literally gave us no model of the benchmark which the illiberal country will have to meet in order to be accepted back into reasonable amounts of trade. We've heard nothing there. Also note that this is contingent firstly on illiberal ruling powers listening to their population, who supposedly, again, the second assumption is trying to convince them that to make the switch to liberalism. And then finally, the third assumption is that they're going to act on this. They haven't mechanized these three progressions in their case.
while we have described, like, firstly, like the immediate impacts of reducing like this interdependence in terms of how citizens are actually going to attribute their renewed suffering to like the liberal countries, which are now leaving them literally in a worse off position. So what we tell you, it's not even going to bother convincing their countries. Note that that's like the first like mechanism and the like 3-step assumption. They're not going to do that because now like they're going to be like opposed to liberalism. I gave like 3 mechanisms as to why that is the case when things are made worse for you. Same goes for the government when they're being like shamed and like rejected on the world stage. So like on F, like liberalization, like liberalism is even less likely to enter into liberal countries when they have these negative outlooks, both of the citizens and of like the country itself. These 3 assumptions are completely unhinged, haven't been mechanized whatsoever. We show you that actually promotes a negative response, which prevents liberalism from entering. Secondly, on like the bargaining power obtained by liberal states, we've been told that liberal countries won't threaten cutting economic harms suffered by themselves. We've been told by third, quote, like economically more prosperous liberal countries, for example, China, can like weather the economic storm. We tell you that these harms are like symmetrical in terms of like the economic harms which like liberal countries would consider when threatening. They're symmetrical on both sides because F is literally like taking this action, and also if like they can weather the storm, these liberal countries, then your course of action has got no impact whatsoever. If that's the line you want to run, you get no change, but you're still going to like piss them off by literally reducing how much money they're brought in. Thirdly, then, on who has a better means of improving liberal countries. Now, what I want to make clear is that the affirmative team has literally ran the same mechanism here in terms of like the long term, because they just get that immediate suffering, which is supposedly going to make these countries change. What is so unique on our side of the house and hasn't been responded to is that we are improved relationship. We're literally interdependent with like a liberal country. Those liberal states are much more likely to adopt our way of thinking. If there's literally any chance of them adopting liberalism, it's going to be when they're in an interdependent relationship with like another economic power who's like bigger than them and has better production, like means of production. That is the only way. We tell you it's like the gradual like adoption of that ideology is like our best means of liberalism making its way into these countries. That's like on top of the barrier which is created by like those immediate resentment caused by F's action, which have brought you there. So we show you that doesn't work. We show you that we've got the better long-term solution. That's why we win this debate so clearly. Proud to negate.
The other team lost this debate when they came up and told us that their way to increase liberalism was simply to sit back and do nothing, just like we are doing now. 3 clashes for the House today. The best way to liberalize a nation, what happens to citizens under both sides, and what happens to the environment. So, to start in with the first clash, what is the best way to liberalize a nation? Both sides have agreed that obviously liberal is better because there are massive human rights abuses under illiberal nations. Now, the negating team didn't really mechanize how they were going to make these illiberal nations liberal, apart from telling us that when you reduce trade, there's less connection between these countries, and so therefore like they wouldn't be able to adopt the ideology. So firstly, we see that today, and we do not see illiberal nations like changing their perspective. We've told you this down the line, that just simply sharing of ideology isn't enough to force them to change. Secondly, we've told you that there is still going to be like knowledge of liberalism, like there's not completely cut off from other nations. You're still going to like know what's happening. And we thoroughly told you that inherently you just want liberalism as a person. You want that for yourself. We don't think this is like an ideology that you just forget. Like you don't just think, oh, I don't want rights. Then they also told us that like these nations, when we stop trading with them, are now going to start simply trading with each other. Okay, we think that at the point that you're missing out on like all this trade from all these liberal nations, you are not going to simply just like be able to get by trading with like Russia and China the way they've described, because you're probably already trading with them before. Like they haven't just come from nowhere, so you're still losing out on all of these countries, which is obviously going to be really harmful. So we have provided 2 clear mechanisms of why, when we reduce this trade, these countries, both the people and the government, are going to be pushed to become liberal. We've said that the people are going to protest, because when you know that the reason that you are like starving, or you're like haven't got a job, or you're really like haven't got much money, is because your government like won't adopt liberal ideologies, you are going to like be really motivated to go out and protest for that much more than you were before, because your situation has now like worsened a little bit. We also said the government is going to be very motivated to change this, because the government is motivated by, you know, like the economics of wanting to be able to like make money. And so at the point where they're losing all this money from all these trade, from this like reduced trade with all these other liberal nations, they're going to think, okay, well, what can we do to fix this? We're going to adopt liberal ideologies. Our side of the house exclusively provides a clear push to these illiberal nations to change their ideologies. The other side of the house does not offer this. Then secondly, what happens to citizens under both sides of the house? So under side neg, we don't really see, under the other side, we don't really see any changes for citizens. Like we don't, because they're not really doing anything. So they're like just continuing in the same circumstances they were in before. And our side of the house, it's been kind of claimed by the other side that there's going to be starvation, it's going to be horrible, the lives are going to like be terrible. And we've come back with 2 responses. We've said that firstly, this won't be the case, because we're reducing trade by a little bit, so that these outcomes are unlikely to be too terrible. And at the point where the outcomes are so terrible that like the country's crippled and everyone's starving, the government is going to like change very quickly. And then we've said, even if the government doesn't change instantly, in the long term, it is much better that the government does at some point change to a liberal government, because that is like so much better for all the future generations of people that are going to live in this country, compared to that like short-term hardship that some people might experience. Finally, in the environment, this went unresponded to. We told you that when we push a liberal governments to become liberal or get more like production in liberal countries, we help the environment. This point still stands. Proud to stand. Thank you.
Well done, you guys. Great
Thank you.
debate.
Good job.
Great job, guys.
Hopefully we don't burst you next round.
What do you guys think of the
What
move?
was the ski?
We liked
ski
it.
lodge been? Because I'm
Oh,
very
yeah.
intrigued by.
You're in a ski lodge?
They're right at the bottom of the ski field.